Hi everyone. My name's Alex, and I worked on the Euro Challenge for 2 years, and I also have a background in economics from Boston University. And today I'll just be going through a brief slide deck, just reiterating some of the main things you'll be touching on in your Euro Challenge presentations, like GDP, unemployment, inflation, and also just some general advice for making a presentation in terms of what makes a compelling visualization or how to handle Q&A. Just some of the things that I've noticed looking at projects over the years as a mentor and also as a judge. And so some of the things I'll be covering are the fundamentals. So these are the indicators, visualizations, policy recommendations, Q&A, and also citing sources. And so first up will be GDP. And so sometimes you hear it on the news and you're not actually seeing what, okay, like you're seeing, okay, like this is the size of the economy. This is like, it's bigger is better, right? But one way that it's taught a lot in a college economics class or a high school economics class is in terms of expenditure, right? And so there's different components of GDP. And so that first bullet point, GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, is where C is consumption. And so consumption is anything that people purchase for pleasure. So, for example, you buying tickets to the newest movie would count as consumption, and it's the biggest part of GDP for a lot of countries. And then I is investment. So that's any physical capital, new construction, or human capital. So a farm purchasing a new tractor is an example of investment. Somebody choosing to go to college is also an investment in human capital. So it's an investment in their education because they think that will return higher wages than if they did not. And then G is government spending. So the government, as you know, spends a lot of money on a lot of things. So defense, healthcare, social security, and then net exports. So net exports is the difference between exports and imports. And exports are things a country produce and sends out, and imports are the inverse. And so whenever you hear, oh, a country has export-led growth, they're usually referring to the fact that they're exporting more than they're importing, right? Because then you see in the first equation, right? It's exports minus imports. So if exports is greater than imports, then it's going to have a positive effect on GDP, right? But if imports are greater, then it's going to have a negative effect. And that's also what we refer to when we're talking about trade deficits and trade surpluses. So GDP growth. For the Euro Challenge and in most discussions, we're talking about GDP growth rate. So how's it changing over time? And usually it's referenced over the previous quarter, so the previous 3 months, or over the same quarter of the previous year. So the previous 3 months of this year compared to the previous 3 months of the last year. And so looking at just a simple equation for that, right? If we're looking at GDP growth from quarter 1 of 2024 to quarter 2 of 2024, it'd just be quarter 2 GDP minus quarter 1 GDP divided by quarter 1 GDP. And then if you want to get a percentage form, you'd multiply it by 100, right? And when we're talking about growth, it's also good to understand, okay, what are the reasons? Why is it growing, right? Is it export-led growth? Is it investment-led growth? Is it a recovery, boosted growth out of recession like after COVID-19? Because, if there's growth, then there's a reason for it, right? And so something that you're not expected to talk about in your presentations at all, but I think it's just helpful to just understand, maybe it helps something click, is that what the most common model that's used in economics class is the Solow growth model. And so you'll see GDP is equal to A times F of L and K. And so F of L and K just means function of labor and capital. So A is technological progress. And so these are changes that boost productivity without increasing capital or labor. So the classic example of this is Henry Ford. And so Henry Ford had a really great idea in terms for his factory of, okay, how do we be more productive? And so he said, okay, we'll have certain people do only one specific part of making that car, right? And so that increased productivity rather than one person doing everything, right? Because why? Over time, people get better at doing the specific thing they're doing, and then everybody's more productive. And then you might have the same amount of people, same factory, same everything, right? Just specialization of labor there. And then the function of labor and capital, labor or workers, and then capital is computers. So to produce something, you need know how to use, you need people, and then you also need tools for people to use, right? So if you take a person and give them a computer, they can accomplish a lot, right? But if you just took a person and they have no computer and they have to do everything on paper, it's gonna be tough to do anything, right? Or if they don't have a tool, right? If you're a farmer out there and using your hands, you're not really gonna grow anything, right? So why does GDP growth matter? So in macroeconomics, we look at fluctuations around long run trends. So in the long run, you see, GDP's rising generally for high income countries, but there are short and medium run fluctuations around that line, due to COVID, due to recessions. So recent examples would be the financial crisis and then COVID. Um, there's long run trends, and then those two things really change things for a lot of countries, and some of these effects are still being seen. And we also care about it because countries could drastically change their trajectory, right? So just like an individual can go from low income to medium or high income over their lifetime, countries could also do the same, right? So countries that have persistent high GDP growth could elevate themselves to a different income bracket, and countries could also go in the opposite direction due to changing demographics. So if their population is aging, or if things are not going well in the labor market, people start leaving. These are things that might cause a country that was once prospering to start to decline and force themselves to look at different policy solutions for that, right? And economists also study GDP growth to understand how standards of living change, right? So it's not always just pure economic terms. It's like, okay, like overall, how are people doing, right? And so the assumption there is that, okay, if you have more and you can consume more, that standard of living is going up. But one thing that's not obviously not perfect about that is how it's measured, right? GDP per capita is just taking GDP and dividing by the population, right? Assuming everything is evenly spread. And we know that's not the case, right? Because wealth and income are not evenly distributed. So that's one reason that you also don't just take GDP per capita and say, yeah, this is overall how everyone's doing. Because if income and wealth are skewed, then it might not be capturing the effects of how everyone's actually doing, right? So you might also want to look at median income or different, like the Gini index for inequality. And then one thing that I've seen over the years, not only in the Euro Challenge, but also in my time in college, is that sometimes people misunderstand GDP growth, right? Like changes, right? So if a GDP growth rate is declining, the growth rate is declining, it does not mean that GDP itself is declining. It just means that the country's GDP is growing slower than it did before. And so easy way to understand this is think about COVID. So the economies of many countries boomed during the recovery from COVID, right? Because they're coming from an abnormally low rate of growth from that historical event. And some grew even 10% quarterly. But eventually their economies, as they recovered, their economies started to cool down and their quarterly growth was positive, but obviously less than it was during the early stages of recovery. So the rate at which they grew slowed down, but was still positive, right? And so moving on to your second indicator is unemployment. And so I pulled the definition straight from your Eurostat, just to be clear. And so the, the Eurostat considers persons between age 15 to 74 who are not working, have looked for work in the last 4 weeks, and are ready to start work within 2 weeks as unemployed, right? And so it's very specific. It's not just, oh, not working. That's not it, right? So key components, age 15 to 74, not working, looked for work in the last 4 weeks, and ready to start work within 2 weeks. So naturally, who is then not unemployed by that metric? So again, people without a job who are not looking for work, and there's different reasons for that, right? So some people might be pursuing a degree full time; they're not considered unemployed. But there's also people that stop looking due to discouragement, right? It's let's say the job market was so bad that they sent out 1,000 applications and they just took a break and they're not looking for work right now. And so that's obviously something that's not good and not captured. And then also people who are younger than 15 and older than 74, right? It's not reasonable to consider people younger than 15 and older than 74 as generally working age. And so when we talk about unemployment, again, we're usually talking about a rate. And so it's defined as taking the number of people unemployed in an economy and dividing by the labor force, and then to get a percentage, you'd multiply by 100. And the labor force consists of unemployed and employed. And so again, the labor force is not considered just people that are discouraged workers or out of the working age population to be in the labor force. And so I kind of mentioned it earlier. What is the unemployment rate miss? Discouraged workers, right? So if a country has lots of discouraged workers who have given up on searching for work, its labor market is presumably not great. But the unemployment rate does not capture this, as just discouraged workers are not considered to be unemployed. And so in the US, for example, there was a lot of debate about what happened to unemployment after the Great Depression, right? Some economists argue that there was more added workers. So after the Great Depression, there was a lot of government programs for government jobs, civil service projects. And so the argument there is that, okay, there's more people that worked because they needed to. So more women working, more people working that might not have worked. They're like retirement age, but times were hard. They lost their savings, and so that contributed to unemployment because there's more added workers, and not all of them were able to find a job. But then other economists also argue that there's more discouraged workers. So there's a lot of people that, oh, I can't find a job depending on where I am, and then they just dropped out of the labor market, which would artificially reduce the unemployment rate. So that's just one idea of some type of nuance that you can get into there. And so another supplementary metric that economists use to talk about what's going on in the labor market is the labor force participation rate. And so that takes the labor force, which we've already defined as unemployed and employed people, and divides by the population and then multiplies by 100, right? So if a country has a lot of people, young people, like younger than 15 and older than 74, then they're going to have a lower labor force participation rate, right? Because their population their labor force as a percentage is lower than other countries. And so what else does it miss? It also misses underemployed workers. And so these are people that are working in jobs where their skills are not fully used or where they're not able to work as many hours as they desire. Classic example here is say you have a college graduate in a field like mechanical engineering that's not able to find employment as an entry-level engineer due to lack of growth in these positions in a given country, and then chooses to work at the local bookstore. That in itself is not a problem, but the problem lies in that if people are not able to find a job in the career path they desire, and they're investing their time and money to go to higher education for, they might look to emigrate in search of other opportunities in other countries, right? And so that's also hammers down the point of why youth unemployment and underemployment are very important for the future of a country, right? If the youth don't feel that they're able to get employed in the thing that they spent, thousands of dollars or euros on and lots of their time, then they might start looking for, okay, like where can I find employment in what I want to do, right? Because naturally, that's human nature. And so moving on to inflation. So the inflation rate is the rate of change in the overall price level in an economy. And it's measured by the European Central Bank using the HICP, which is the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices. And so what the HICP does is it takes prices of a basket of common household goods and services and then standardizes them across different Eurozone countries because prices are different, right, in between the 20 countries. And the basket is updated annually to reflect household consumption, right? So if there's a new technological advancement and you start moving from to a different good, then the basket will be updated, right? Because otherwise we don't really care about a good that's not being used anymore. And also they also take into consideration if a good is improved and the cost also increases. And then another thing that a lot of people see on the news is that there's a lot of discussion about core inflation, right? And so this is inflation that excludes goods with large price fluctuations like food and energy. And one way to think about why it's not included is that if you look at the change in, like, for example, price of eggs lately, everyone's been talking about it. It's been fluctuating astronomically. It not would not be a great reliable estimator of overall price changes because it's something that's just going zig up and down, right? You want to look at, okay, what are more stable, long-term, sticky changes. And then similar to GDP growth, to be important to be aware of, if the inflation rate is declining, it does not mean that prices themselves are falling. It means the rate at which prices are rising is slowing down, right? So when we look at it, say the inflation rate goes from 4% to 3% from quarter 3 to quarter 4. Inflation is slowing down, right? It went from 4 to 3, but prices are still rising. 3% is not negative, right? But if the inflation rate is negative, then overall actual prices are declining and the country is experiencing deflation, which is not a good thing because it means just usually things are going wrong under the hood where there's not enough demand to meet production, or people are saving money for a rainy day. So why does inflation matter? So I think when I was in college, a lot of times you just hear, you're just going through the motions, but sometimes it's good to try to think about it on the human level first. So on the human level, people generally don't want to have to pay more for their hobbies and their groceries. Like, who wants to pay more for their apples, right? Who wants to pay more to see a movie? No one. It makes it harder to make ends meet, so groceries, rent, and it makes it harder to pursue higher education, right? So, because higher education, they also have to charge fees, right? So in order to have you in their dorms and feed you and pay the professors to teach you. So they're also affected by inflation. And on the firm level, so the classic example people look at is, okay, like this supply chain. Say theoretically, if Apple had to pay more for the minerals in their phones, their profit margins would decline if they didn't offset the costs by being either more productive or by raising prices. And then now moving on to the last fundamental that you cover in your first part of your presentations is monetary policy. And so the Eurozone is in a unique situation because they share currency across different borders, right? And so their monetary policy also looks different than other regions. And so for the Eurozone, it's controlled by the European Central Bank on behalf of the 20 Eurozone countries. And the governing council is the main decision maker within the ECB, and it has 6 members of the executive board and also governors of national central banks from each Eurozone country. So each Eurozone country is obviously represented in these decisions. And it's a tool to stabilize the Eurozone economy through modifying key interest rates every 6 weeks. And the stated goal is for 2% inflation overall for the Eurozone, so average across all 20 countries. And so why do interest rates matter? Interest rates are the cost of borrowing money, and also the rate of return for lenders, right? There's two people here. This person borrowing money, and then this person lending the money to the borrower, right? And so classic example here is buying a house. So when you're buying a house, you don't go in there and say, okay, here's $500,000 cash. You have a down payment and then the rest you owe, right? And so you take out a mortgage loan, and you owe money over time to the bank. And because the bank's letting you do this, like, right, live in a house and based on the assumption that, oh, you're going to pay it back, they charge you an interest rate. So each month your payment goes partially towards interest and the rest toward paying the remainder, the actual principal of the loan. And so the higher your interest rate is, the harder it is to pay off your house because your monthly interest rates are higher, right? And so one thing that can get overlooked is during the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, a lot of people got in trouble because they had floating interest rates where interest rates were lower for the first few years of their mortgage loan, and it spiked, right? And so when things spiked, a lot of people defaulted on their loans, and it was a lot of people had a lot of homes that they couldn't really afford, but were investing in because there was a housing bubble where everybody was buying houses on the assumption that the housing value is going to increase. And so eventually that bubble burst. A lot of people defaulted on their loans, and then a lot of big banks owned had sold insurance on bonds that were backed by these mortgage loans, and so they had to buy that insurance back from people, and that's the story of how the housing market kind of destroyed the entire global economy in 2008, 2009, right? So that's just one reason for why interest rates matter, right? A lot of people, it was a combination of factors, but the floating interest rates is what partially let people think that they could afford the home. And then when the interest rates went up, that's when they defaulted, and a lot of people defaulted all the time, and that leads to bad things, right? And so the ECB controls three main interest rates. So the deposit facility rate, and so that's the rate that banks receive when they're depositing funds overnight with the ECB. Main refinancing operations. So that's the rate at which banks can borrow from the ECB, and marginal lending facility. And this is the rate at which banks can borrow funds overnight from the ECB, and it's high and it's higher than the main refinancing operations rate. And so, again, just another slide about why interest rates matter, because a lot of this is talking about banks, right? Like what rate the ECB gives banks that for their deposits, or what rate the ECB charges banks to borrow funds. As my EC 202 professor would always say, interest rates go together. So the clear link here is interest rates set by the ECB to banks affect the interest rates that banks offer to individuals and firms on deposits and what they charge for loans, right? So if a bank must pay 3% interest to borrow from the ECB, it's obviously going to require at least 3% interest from individuals and firms, right? And so all else equal, when interest rates increase, people are incentivized to invest in interest-bearing assets such as bonds, and firms are disincentivized to take on loans, right? Because people, if you have savings, you think, okay, if there is a bond that's going to give me, like decent interest rate, like say the interest rate increased by like 2%, you'd be like, okay, I'd rather put some of my money in there, right? And they're going to save more. And then firms are like, okay, you're telling me I have to pay, 2% more to take out a construction loan. Well, that might be the difference between my project being profitable or not. So I might hold off on that until interest rates are lower. So moving on to another key aspect of presentations is visualizations. And so how I like to think about it is that visualization is a story. And so different types of graphs that you probably going to use in your presentations are line graph, right? So this is a story of how something changed over time, and it could be relative to other countries. So you might have three different line graphs on the same graph, and you might, make one a different color to highlight the country that you're focusing on. You also have bar graphs. So say you're comparing, GDP growth across all Eurozone countries. And generally, less is more it's in terms of complexity and also just noise. And I think a good rule of thumb here is that if you can't explain the graph, then it's not a good idea to use it. And that's not to say, oh, if you can't explain the graph the second you see it, don't use it. But I think it's a good idea if you're going to use it, that you should learn to be able to interpret it, right? And some essentials here, a source. So if you didn't create it, put that underneath, right? A title, axis label. So what are we looking at on the x-axis and the y-axis? And so another thing that you're going to encounter is extreme points on a graph, right? So pretty much any indicator you're going to look at, obviously, is going to be very extreme around 2020 because of COVID. And as you can see here, everything else looks very tiny compared to it. And one option, if you wanted to, is to scale down the data if you wanted to make it to be able to highlight other fluctuations other than 2020. So you could divide everything by two or three, so that the min and max are not so extreme, and then keep the same axis tick so that it still shows the same value. And then, you could explain that you scaled it down, or should be obvious to the judge. But yeah, pretty much the moral here is just keep this in mind if you're trying to point out trends that seem tiny compared to the huge changes around 2020, because that just visually you're seeing 2020 dominate, right? And next thing would be some design cues. So I think it's important when you're creating a graph or choosing a graph that there's certain stylistic choices that make it easier for the viewer to be like, okay, you don't even need to tell me. That's where my eyes are going, right? And so if you look at the graph on the right, I'm going to assume that your eyes immediately go to that shaded bar for the euro area. Why? Because it's different from everything else, right? And it doesn't have to be color based. You could have an arrow, you could use a different shape. But the idea is if you're going to, right, if you want to focus attention, it's good to have it visually too, right? That's the point of a graph, right? Rather than having to, spell it out. And then, so moving on to policy recommendations. So this is the thing that I think is very important to understand, that it's good to be creative, but you're also going to have to defend whatever you're presenting, right? For a lot of reasons, right? Because one, the policy recommendation is your conclusion of your presentation. It's the last thing your judges are hearing before they're going into Q&A. So obviously they're going to have a lot of that is recently in their mind, and they're going to have questions about it, and they're also going to be interested, right? That's a big reason why, a big reason why we're doing this, right? We want to understand a key issue in the world, in a country, and say, okay, how can we help improve this? How do we think we could work towards a better future, right? So on that point, I think feasibility is very important. So, for example, if your policy is to fully welcome migrants, but there are not enough translators that speak the language, there's going to be logistical challenges, right? And that's not to say it can't be overcome, but that's something you're going to have to explain, right? If you say, okay, yeah, let's have everybody from the world come in, how are you going to communicate with them, right? If they don't speak the same language. Or, for example, if your policy is to go invest billions in AI, but your country does not have the given expertise, is it reasonable for them to catch up, right? Or are there other sectors of the future that your country may have a competitive advantage in? Right? And that's not to say, oh, like, it's not an option. But again, if you do say, okay, let's just put billions of dollars in AI, and then you mention, okay, we don't really have the infrastructure, we don't really have the expertise in our country, then the judge is probably going to ask you, okay, like, is this, can you explain why you made this decision, or like, what's your plan? So that's just a big part, just the feasibility. And then costs. So how is it going to be financed? Is it going to be through, um, you're going to divert funds from the government, divert funds that your country's currently spending on different programs for it? Are you going to borrow from the ECB? Are you going to pull funds from the overall from the for the that are available for the EU as a whole? And what are the expected costs, right? So if you're saying, let's just give everybody 1,000 euros every month, that's going to be very expensive, right? And it's going to have to come from somewhere. And then timeline. So obviously you're not going to go sit there and say, okay, this is what we're going to do every single month for the next 10 years. But I think it's good to kind of have a general idea for what you think would be reasonable. Like, okay, like 1 year, like what do you think could be done in year one, or what could be done in 5 years? What could be done in 10 years, right? And then the last thing would be metrics of success. So like if everything went to plan, what would you use to evaluate the success of the program, right? Is it, say you're trying to, curb brain drain. So what would you measure to say, okay, like you say, okay, like there's the percentage change of people leaving, of college graduates leaving. Is that our success? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 15%? Is it certain majors that you're looking for that were previously leaving the country, and we're focusing on that? Just defining what is success for your policy. That's very key. And then moving on from that, I think a lot of times it's easy to conflate a recommendation versus an idea. And so a policy recommendation is specific, right? And so I've kind of been harping on that in the last slide. Example would be, okay, say a country should provide a 10% tax break to private companies in a sector for competitive advantage to facilitate investment and export-led growth, right? Whereas idea is more general, right? It's like saying a country should boost investment to facilitate growth. It doesn't have the how, it doesn't have the who, right? It doesn't have the cost. And so moving on to the last portion of your presentations, right, is your Q&A. And obviously the nerves are there. You just finished your 15-minute presentation. You're like, oh, thankfully I remembered everything. We're good. We're almost done. I think it's really important here to just breathe. Take a second to understand the question, because sometimes it could be easy to just want to just spit the answer right back. But it's okay to think, okay, like, all right, that's what they mean, and then collect your thoughts. Um, there's no perfect answer. I think that's something that I'd like to stress. You're not just you're not going to be able to give a perfect answer because there's just not a perfect answer. You can give an impressive answer, but there's nuance in economics, right? There's different point of views. There's different angles you could take as long as you're justifying it, right? If your logic is sound. And another thing I think gets underlooked is share the work. And so this is the last portion that judges are seeing from your team, right? So just think about it. They they grade you, right, after everything you've done. And what is the last thing that they've remembered? And so, if given that context, if only one or two students answered most of the questions, that's kind of their last impression of you. So just keep that in mind. Um, and then also be candid. A lot of times the answer is revolves something around it depends. So obviously you don't say it depends, but for example, when we say that when interest rates rise, we expect inflation to also rise, all else equal in economics. But the real world is not an all else equal situation. There might be other things outside of inflation and interest rate, outside of interest rates that are affecting inflation, right? That might be stronger than the interest rate change. So say the interest rate's like a tiny increase, it might not change anything because it's like, all right, that's not enough for me to do anything. Um, but yeah, I think that it's really important just to, try to breathe. Remember, there's no perfect answer and share the work, right? And yeah, those are the main points that I had. And then I think the other thing to just remember is, be proud of your work. You spend a lot of time on it. So just try to have fun with it. You're doing things that a lot of people in college are not even doing, right? Taking a real world issue and trying to figure out a solution, right? And a lot of times these are challenging issues, and that's the point of why you choose them and the point of why, they're interesting, right? You want to understand what's going on and what can we do to make a better future. And it's complicated, right? Sometimes you have to convince people of why it works. Sometimes there's things that happen that you don't expect, right? Outside your control. Nobody anticipated COVID-19. Most people in the world did not anticipate the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. So, but yeah, you're doing great work and just keep it up.